October 20th, 2011. Muammar Gaddafi, once one of the most powerful men in Africa, is dragged from a drainage pipe by rebel fighters. Bloodied and beaten, he pleads for his life. Just minutes later, he is dead. But how did this happen? How did a revolutionary who seized power at 27, ruled for over 4 decades and dreamed of a united Africa, end up hunted like an animal in his own country? This is the story of Gaddafi, the man who defied the West, challenged the global oil system, and paid the ultimate price for it. Beneath the scorching sun of the North African desert, a kingdom once stood. Ancient, silent, rich in oil and stories. Libya, a nation carved between ancient Mediterranean empires and boundless dunes, was about to become the stage for one of the most complex, controversial, and unforgettable tales of modern political history. It is a story that begins in obscurity, in a small Bedouin tent on the outskirts of Sirte, where a boy named Muammar was born in 1942 to a nomadic goat herder and his wife. No royal blood, no noble title, just sand, hardship, and an undying sense of destiny. That boy would one day rise to command not just a nation, but the imagination of an entire continent. His name would echo through the halls of power, feared in Western capitals and praised in many parts of Africa. For over 4 decades, Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya with fire and fervor. He claimed to be a liberator of the oppressed, a soldier of Islam, and a prophet of a new African era. Yet he also ruled with an iron fist, crushing dissent, funding shadow wars, and maintaining a paranoid grip over his people. Gaddafi would rewrite the rules of leadership. He defied monarchy, rejected conventional democracy, and invented his own strange brand of governance, one where the leader was not a president, not a king, but a self-proclaimed brother leader and guide of the revolution. To his admirers, he was the voice of the voiceless, a man who stood up to the West and dreamed of a united Africa. To his enemies, he was a madman in a golden tent, a delusional autocrat whose eccentricity masked cruelty. Over time, Libya transformed, from a monarchy beholden to foreign interests to a militarized oil power, from a stable state to a fractured battlefield. The journey between those extremes is a timeline of ambition, ideology, betrayal, and blood. And when the end came, it came swiftly and violently. In 2011, during the Arab Spring, the very people who once chanted his name turned against him. Gaddafi, who had declared he would die on Libyan soil, made good on that promise. But his death would not bring peace. Instead, it opened a void, and from that void emerged chaos that still haunts Libya today. So who was Muammar Gaddafi? A hero or a tyrant? A visionary or a madman? This documentary does not seek to judge, but to uncover, to dig beneath the myths and unveil the man who wore 1,000 masks. We will trace his rise from the deserts of Sirte, through the palace gates of Tripoli, to his final hours hiding in a storm drain. We will hear his words, examine his wars, and weigh his dreams. Because the story of Gaddafi is not just a Libyan story. It is the story of post-colonial Africa, of power, of oil, of rebellion, of a man who dared to challenge the world and paid the ultimate price. Muammar Gaddafi did not inherit power. He took it with vision, audacity, and a young man's righteous anger. As a child of the desert, he saw colonialism not as history, but as a living wound. Libya had suffered decades under foreign domination, first by the Italians, then the British and Americans. Oil had been discovered, but its wealth flowed outward while Libyans remained poor. King Idris I ruled with Western blessing, but his throne stood on fragile ground. In the quiet shadows of this unrest, Gaddafi was watching, listening, learning. He studied at the University of Libya and later enrolled in the Benghazi Military Academy. It was there that he immersed himself in the teachings of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president who championed Arab nationalism and anti-imperialism. Gaddafi, still in his 20s, became obsessed with the idea of a pan-Arab revolution, a rebellion against monarchs, borders, and Western puppeteers. Then, in the early hours of September 1st, 1969, lightning struck. Without firing a single shot, Gaddafi and a group of fellow officers from the Free Officers Movement seized control of the government. King Idris, unaware, was in Turkey for medical treatment. By dawn, the monarchy had fallen. Libya was no longer a kingdom, it was a republic. But this was no ordinary republic. Gaddafi did not assume the title of president. Instead, he became chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council. His ideology was simple in theory, but radical in execution. Islam without extremism, socialism without Marxism, Arab unity without borders. The people would rule through direct democracy, or so he claimed. In the early years, he won genuine support. He kicked out American and British bases. He nationalized oil companies. He distributed land and wealth to Libyans. Schools, hospitals, roads, all improved under his watch. To many, he was a hero, a young, charismatic leader who spoke the language of the people and the fury of the oppressed. But power is seductive, and ideology, when unchecked, often turns into dogma. As the 1970s unfolded, Gaddafi published his political manifesto, the Green Book. A strange and rambling document, it was neither entirely capitalist nor communist. It rejected representative democracy and called for people's committees to take charge of society. Libya would become a Jamahiriya, a stateless state ruled by the masses. But in truth, all roads led to Gaddafi. By 1977, he had declared himself not a ruler, but the brother leader of the revolution, a title vague enough to mean anything and powerful enough to mean everything. No constitution, no parliament, no checks or balances. Just the revolutionary guide standing above the state, shaping Libya in his image. What began as a rebellion against monarchy was slowly evolving into a new kind of autocracy, one shrouded in revolutionary language, yet increasingly centered around a single man. The world watched, some applauded, others grew wary. But the people of Libya, they listened, waited, and wondered. Was this the dawn of a new era, or the first act of a dangerous experiment? By the early 1970s, Muammar Gaddafi was no longer just a revolutionary. He was now a ruler, one whose grip on Libya grew tighter with each passing year. Oil was his weapon, and with Libya's vast reserves at his command, Gaddafi quickly transformed a poor desert country into one of the wealthiest per capita nations in Africa. The nationalization of foreign oil companies brought billions into state coffers. Roads were paved, new hospitals opened, and education, once a privilege, became a right. Illiteracy plummeted. Libya was rising. But the wealth came at a cost. Dissent was not tolerated. Gaddafi's rule, though cloaked in populist ideals, grew more authoritarian with time. Secret police patrolled neighborhoods. Informants lurked in universities. Public executions were televised to set examples. Fear became a silent citizen in every Libyan home. To the outside world, Gaddafi was becoming something of a riddle. He dressed in flamboyant robes, pitched tents in foreign capitals, and preached pan-African unity with the same passion he used to denounce the West. He mocked democracy, claiming Libya had created a third universal theory, superior to capitalism and communism, and he exported revolution like a missionary of chaos. During the 1980s, Libya became a global pariah. Gaddafi openly funded insurgent groups and militant factions across Africa and the Middle East. He supported the IRA in Northern Ireland, Palestinian fighters, and rebel groups in Chad, Sudan, and elsewhere. Some hailed him as a defender of the oppressed. Others called him a sponsor of terror. His most infamous international scandal came in 1988 when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 270 people. Western intelligence agencies traced the attack to Libyan agents. Sanctions followed. Embassies were closed. Libya became isolated. Even the Arab world began to distance itself from its once celebrated revolutionary son. Inside Libya, opposition was extinguished. Gaddafi's people's committees became tools of surveillance and control. His inner circle shrank. He trusted no one, not even his own family. He would regularly reshuffle his ministers, sometimes imprisoning them without charges, then reinstating them months later. Power in Gaddafi's world was both a performance and a punishment. Yet, despite his erratic rule, he remained in charge. No election ever tested his popularity. No constitution limited his reach. In his eyes, he was not a dictator. He was the revolution, alive, eternal, necessary. And still, in the midst of repression, he dreamed of a single African currency, of a United States of Africa, of a continental army to push back imperialism. In his grandest fantasies, Gaddafi was no longer just a Libyan leader. He saw himself as Africa's philosopher king, the only man who could awaken the sleeping giant. But ambition can blind, and isolation breeds delusion. As Gaddafi tightened his grip on Libya, he loosened his ties with reality. The world had changed, but in the palaces of Tripoli, time stood still. By the early 1990s, Muammar Gaddafi found himself increasingly alone. The Cold War had ended. The United States had emerged as the world's unchallenged superpower, and Libya, once a proud symbol of anti-imperial defiance, had become a cautionary tale. The world had not forgotten Lockerbie, nor the UTA Flight 772 bombing over Niger. Libya's name was now permanently etched into the global discourse on state-sponsored terrorism. And so, the hammer came down. The United Nations imposed sweeping sanctions. Libya's airspace was restricted. Trade was crippled. Diplomatic doors slammed shut one after another. Gaddafi had wanted to shape world history. Instead, he became history's prisoner. For ordinary Libyans, the pain was real. The economy suffered. Inflation surged. Flights were grounded. Universities fell behind. Medicine became scarce. Libya's oil still pumped beneath the ground, but the country's potential seemed to wither above it. And yet, Gaddafi did not flinch. Instead, he rebranded. The dictator became the philosopher. He spent long nights penning essays, strange, rambling, sometimes visionary, and publishing them through his infamous Green Book. He insisted Libya was a stateless democracy, where power rested in the hands of the people. But in truth, only one man ruled. Then the world changed again, this time in Gaddafi's favor. In 2003, the U.S. invasion of Iraq sent shockwaves through authoritarian regimes across the Middle East. Saddam Hussein had been toppled. The message was clear. Weapons of mass destruction would no longer be tolerated. Gaddafi took notice. Quietly, then publicly, he reached out to the West. In a surprise move, Libya announced that it would abandon its weapons of mass destruction program. Western inspectors were invited in. Stockpiles were surrendered. Intelligence was shared. It was a dramatic turnaround. And in return, the sanctions were lifted. Diplomacy thawed. And suddenly, the same leaders who had condemned Gaddafi were shaking his hand. In 2004, then British Prime Minister Tony Blair visited Tripoli. The image of Blair and Gaddafi shaking hands was surreal. The man once dubbed the Mad Dog of the Middle East was now being welcomed back into the international fold. Oil deals flowed. Western companies returned. For a moment, it seemed as if Gaddafi had outmaneuvered history itself. But make no mistake, the man had not changed. He was simply adapting. Behind the scenes, Libya's prisons remained full. Dissent was still punished. Surveillance remained intense. While Gaddafi portrayed himself as a reformed statesman, his people still lived under the shadow of his rule. He was a dictator in diplomat's clothing, mastering the art of global performance. Still, many in Africa and parts of the Arab world admired his resilience. Gaddafi funded African Union projects, paid debts for smaller nations, and championed causes neglected by global powers. To some, he was still the bold voice against neo-colonialism. To others, a chameleon who knew how to survive the tides. But in the shadows, new forces were stirring, a generation raised under his rule. Young, unemployed, connected by satellite TV and the internet, was beginning to ask dangerous questions. How long could a leader, no matter how clever, outrun the future? In the early months of 2011, a whisper swept across North Africa and the Middle East. From Tunisia to Egypt, Syria to Yemen, people rose. They had only their voices, their phones, and their rage. They called it the Arab Spring, but for many in power, it felt like a storm. And for Muammar Gaddafi, it was the beginning of the end. In Benghazi, Libya's second-largest city, the spark ignited. What began as peaceful protests over the arrest of a human rights lawyer quickly spiraled into open rebellion. Decades of repression, censorship, and economic disparity exploded into raw fury. Gaddafi, used to crushing dissent in the shadows, now faced a nationwide revolt in the full glare of global cameras. But the brother leader would not go quietly. In a defiant televised address, Gaddafi raged. He promised to hunt his enemies house to house, alley to alley, like rats. His voice trembled with anger. His eyes burned with disbelief. This was not just an uprising. To him, it was betrayal. Soon, Libya descended into chaos. Rebels formed militias, cities fell, others became battlegrounds. Gaddafi's forces struck back with brutal airstrikes and armored assaults. But the tide had shifted. His old tricks, threats, propaganda, divide and conquer, were no longer enough. Then came the world's response. The United Nations approved a no-fly zone over Libya. NATO warplanes darkened the skies. Airstrikes pummeled loyalist strongholds. For the first time in 42 years, Gaddafi was on the defensive. Tripoli, once the heart of his rule, shook with gunfire and uncertainty. His palaces were bombed, his sons hunted, his generals defected. Still, he would not flee. He believed he was Libya, that without him the nation would collapse. Ironically, in resisting his fall, he accelerated the nation's unraveling. In October 2011, Gaddafi's convoy tried to escape his besieged hometown of Sirte. NATO jets struck. Wounded and desperate, the man who once ruled Libya with fire and gold hid in a storm drain beneath the road. Dirty, disoriented, and surrounded, he was dragged out by rebel fighters. The world watched, some in horror, others in grim satisfaction, as a battered, bloodied Gaddafi was beaten and shot. His final words, reportedly, "What did I do to you?" And just like that, the Gaddafi era ended. A rule that began with a bloodless coup ended in brutal bloodshed. But Libya did not rejoice for long. What came after was not peace, but a power vacuum. Militias clashed for control. Warlords carved up territory. The same rebels who once stood united against tyranny now fought one another. Democracy faltered. Extremism thrived. Cities crumbled. Oil exports stalled. Dreams faded. Some began to ask, was the devil they knew better than the chaos they got? To his enemies, Gaddafi's death was justice. To his loyalists, it was martyrdom. To historians, it was an inflection point. His downfall was not just about a man. It was about a nation, a continent, and the question that haunts every revolution. What happens after the dictator dies? The guns may have fallen silent, but Libya did not find peace. When Muammar Gaddafi died in October 2011, many expected the country to rise from the ashes into democracy, unity, and rebirth. Instead, Libya became a land haunted by his memory, fractured, wounded, and uncertain. In the power vacuum left behind, the ghosts of dictatorship gave way to a new nightmare, lawlessness. With no strong institutions, no agreed constitution, and no shared vision, Libya spiraled into a civil war of factions. The revolutionary militias, once united against Gaddafi, began fighting each other for cities, ports, and power. Tripoli, the capital, saw governments come and go. Benghazi, once the heart of the revolution, was consumed by violence. Sirte, Gaddafi's birthplace and final refuge, became the battleground of new evils. By 2014, the country was split, not just politically, but ideologically and geographically. Rival governments claimed legitimacy, one in the east, backed by generals and foreign allies, another in the west, clinging to the fragile threads of international support. In the midst of this chaos, extremist groups like ISIS seized the opportunity. For a time, they planted their black flags in Libyan soil, turning towns into execution fields and launching attacks that reverberated across the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the people, the same people who once danced in the streets after Gaddafi's fall, began to despair. Fuel shortages, power outages, unpaid salaries, kidnappings, corruption. For many, life under the new Libya became a daily struggle. There was no more green book, no more bizarre speeches or golden tents, but there was also no leadership, no safety, no vision. Outside Libya, world powers looked on. Some tried to intervene with diplomacy, Others fueled the war through proxy interests, arms, oil, influence. The same NATO countries that helped oust Gaddafi now watched as Libya collapsed into a failed state. The West had removed the tyrant but failed to prepare for the aftermath. The world had underestimated how deeply the regime's control had penetrated every corner of Libyan life. And yet, despite it all, Libya remains unbroken. Scarred, yes, but not defeated. In recent years, there have been attempts at reconciliation, peace summits, UN-led talks, a ceasefire here, a fragile truce there. Libyans from all sides have begun to realize, without unity, there is no future. As for Gaddafi's legacy, it remains as polarizing as the man himself. Some call him a visionary, a pan-Africanist who gave Libya dignity and independence. Others see only the despot, the torture chambers, the repression, the egomania. But one thing is certain, Gaddafi changed Libya forever. Today his image lingers in murals, in memory, in myth. His children, scattered or dead, his regime dismantled. But the questions he posed about African sovereignty, Western hypocrisy, oil control, and the cost of revolution still echo. Libya's story did not end with his death. In many ways, it began again, more complicated, more painful, and still unwritten. In the shifting sands of North Africa, where empires rise and fall, Muammar Gaddafi remains a symbol of both what was and what might have been. And Libya? Libya still waits for healing, for justice, for a future beyond the shadow of its past.